Si vous pouvez couper vos micros aussi, peut-être. Bah non, Sylvie, peut-être pas, mais tant qu'on ne parle pas, essayez de couper les micros.
Wow.
Hello, welcome today to the Montpellier Ecology and Evolution seminar series brought to us by LabEx CEMEB, with support of LabEx CEMEB. Today we have Anne Atlan from the University of Rennes. She'll be introduced in a moment by Sylvie Langy. Just before we start, just to remind you, if you'd like to ask questions, please can you ask them using the Q&A tab on the bottom right hand of your screen. The seminar today is being recorded, so you'll be able to see it shortly on our YouTube channel. And also just to remind you that for the next 2 weeks, it's the school holidays, so there won't be any seminars, and the next seminar will be on the 5th of March, and that will be Daniel Weinrich at 11:30. Okay, thank you very much. Over to Sylvie.
Yeah, yes. Well, thank you to everyone for being here. I'm going to introduce Anne very briefly before she gives her speech. Anne Atlan is currently a research director at the CNRS. She did her PhD at the CEF in Montpellier in evolutionary genetics. Then she worked at the Paris 6 Jussieu University at the genetics lab, and then she moved to the Ecologie lab. Since 2009, she's been progressively integrating sociology and philosophy of the environment into her work. And she made the choice to join a social science lab named ESSO, Espace et Société in Rennes, and she works at the interface between ecology and sociology. Her field of interest includes invasive species and beyond, the values of nature, and the notion of natural heritage. She's also involved in participatory research approaches, and she's presently doing her fieldwork, lucky her, at the Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean. That's where she is today. So we met with Anne at the last CNRS Summer School on participatory action research in Metz in 2019. And since we've been in touch. So please, Anne, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you for the CEF for inviting me. It's very special since it is a place where I did my PhD a long time ago. And so now I will share my screen. Okay, and I told you about my current work and propose you the concept of invasive niche as illustrated by Gorse. I'm in Réunion Island, and that's a picture that you have in front of you of Réunion Island. And on the left side of the picture is Gorse Ulex, en français, the plant on which I worked for 4 years. I will tell you a quite long story to introduce the concept and the way we thought about it and the way we tested it. So Gorse Ulex en français is an emblematic species, not only in Brittany, not only since 1916, but for almost the Middle Age and in a lot of countries of Western France. So it is appreciated and protected sometimes when necessary, while in other parts of the world, it is a noxious weed, a pest that has to be destroyed with fire or any kind of mechanical, chemical, or biological control. This situation is not totally unusual. It is even common that is most of the time invasive species do not pose problem in their area of origin. It is only when they are introduced to a new environment that problems arise and that the species become invasive. And that was a long time question. Why do some species become invasive when introduced into a new environment? Before answering to that question, I will just try to specify what does it mean to be invasive. In contrast to what is sometimes claimed, there is no clear definition. The definition evolves through time and also depends on the context and on the stakeholder. From an initial idea of geographic expansion, we move to an importance of negative impacts that may be either ecological or sociological. You have here some examples of definitions. For ecologists, the emphasis is made on negative impact on biodiversity. For experts or lawyers, it is also economics, health, ecosystem services, and the idea that the species has to be not only exotic but introduced by man is important. So the question is, why do some species become invasive when introduced into a new environment? Let's see what response ecologists and evolutionists. For them, it's because the species was introduced without its natural enemies, so the demographic equilibrium is broken, there is nothing to regulate the population, and as a consequence, the population increase, but also because less energy is put on defense, there increased competitive ability, and so on. There are also some question of invasibility of the environment, but for the species itself, the idea is that the ecological characteristics of the species are different. For sociologists, the question is not exactly the same. The question is, why are some species considered as invasive when introduced into a new environment? And then the answers include the fear of the unknown, the absence of pre-existing usage and practicals or control methods, the fact that man is reduced to the role of a disruptive force in nature. If it's introduced by man, it's not good for the ecosystem. The sacralization of the dichotomy of the endemic diversity, which is a good one, and the exotic diversity, which does not deserve such interest. And the fact that the scientific viewpoint dominates the debate, why for the population and the local users, sometimes the viewpoint is different. So anyhow, to summarize, they think that the sociological characteristics of the situation are different. Of course, my point is that the truth lies in between, or not in between, but include both. This is what I will show you on gorse, which is a spiny shrub, Fabaceae, with a lot of proteins, perennial, keeps 20 years, hexaploid with a very large genetic diversity and a high potential of adaptation. Gorse was introduced all over the world during the colonization by Europeans during the 19th century. We will see later why. So it is present in almost all parts of the world that are old European colonies. And almost everywhere it is considered as invasive. So because it is also very difficult to eradicate, it is one of the world's worst invasive species, one of the 30 plants of that list in the list of the UICN. Indeed, it can expand in a very uncontrolled geographic expansion. That is a photograph taken in New Zealand, which is the most invaded country. All the yellow is a gorse, beautiful, but invasive. And it can escape from hedges. The word escape is not from me, it's what you find in the literature. So that's, it's not in flower, but it's gorse. And because yes, I wanted to say gorse flower 10 months a year. So in most of photographs, it is the flower. This some not. So that's a hedge in Réunion Island. And when the field is not maintained, gorse go to the grassland, which is not usable for breeders, and then you just have a big bush of gorse. So indeed, gorse is different, the species is different, the characteristics are different in invaded countries and in the area of origin. In New Zealand, it's common to see gorse with 4 meters high or more, while it's never more than 1.52 meters in Europe. This is also the enormous gorse in La Réunion. We did a study with one of my PhD students. We cut what we thought to be a bush to make measure of seed bank. And we cut, and when we arrived close to that point, we realized that it was only one plant with 14 branches, each of these branches being as big as one gorse in Brittany, in Europe. So indeed, there are some differences that may result from the environment, but we have shown that there are also clearly genetics maintained in controlled conditions. You see here, New Zealand seedlings are bigger than Scotland, where they come from, where the population come from, and Réunion seedlings are larger. We made several measures on that kind. That was the thesis of Benjamin Renoir. We compared Brittany, Scotland with natural enemies, and Réunion and New Zealand with almost no natural enemies. We made a lot of measures to test growth, reproduction, parasitism, and genetics. We found sometimes differences, sometimes no differences. We understood that indeed the species is more grow faster and it's more competitive there, but no clear evidence of a link with enemy release. We then decided to propose our own hypothesis, which is not linked with mean, but with correlation, with the idea being that where the weevil is present in the native range, the strategy to prevent predation creates some genetic correlations that block constrain the adaptability of the species, while in the absence of these enemies, there is an increase in vulnerability. So we tried as hard as we could. We found some explanation, but it was clear for us that this was not enough. By doing that work, we did a lot of field work in Europe, Réunion, New Zealand, and we make actors. And what I see there is that really for people, it was a hate of gorse. Sometimes they told me it cannot be the same species when they saw how much we like it in Brittany. It was a plant enemy #1 in New Zealand. And that variability of perception appeared to me could not result only from ecological differences. So the first thing we do is go back to Réunion Island, which we know well, where they speak French, which is easier when you want to make survey on social sciences, and try to retrace the history of introduction. That was the end of the thesis of Benjamin Renoir, his postdoc, and the first came of a sociologist in the story, Catherine Darrow, and together we directed the thesis of Nathalie Hudot. We found first that in Europe, there was a lot of various usages from the Middle Age to the mid of the 20th century for fodder, because it is rich in protein, for hedges. You see a large hedge here in South Brittany, Grand Brittany, fertilizer, animal bedding, etc. A lot of usage, which made, like during the colonization time, agronomists encourage the use of gorse, and New Zealand even sometimes oblige people to plant gorse. Well, a few years later, they obliged people to remove gorse, but that was much more complicated. And that's what is explained here in that paper by a historian of New Zealand, Gorse, a good servant, but a tyrannous master. Indeed, what happened is that the technical constraints were not introduced. The fodder must be made with dedicated machine, and that was written nowhere in the agronomist books. And also hedge and field bordered by hedge have to be controlled, and that also was brought nowhere. It was known in the area of origin, but this knowledge was not transmitted. So not transmitted, the way to mean, the way to control, or sometimes just not adapted, because using gorse is interesting, but it has a lot of work that is not compatible with the open field of New Zealand, for example. So the invasiveness of gorse came for large world distribution, exploitation to all European colony for agricultural purpose, and its fast expansion results from both increased growth and reproduction and the absence of know-how, so that there is a geographic expansion that is still ongoing. So I wonder how to predict gorse expansion and invasion. This is what we knew after the previous studies, we had some points, some dates of introduction, but we wanted to go further and to have an exact distribution. To do so, we went to the databases, made personal observation in Réunion, New Zealand, but not only, personal communication from colleagues or friends, papers, flora, guides, and geolocated photographs. We had lots of points that you validated, suppress all the doublons, verify the source, the date, the location, the photos, and then a sample to have a sampling homogenization of square of 5 or 10 kilometers square. This is a kind of photo you can find of the net and show you how it's possible to validate through photos. Gorse is very visible. It's flower, as I say, 10 months a year. So in most of photos, it is flowering. While it's not, it is quite easily recognizable. And that's also interesting because it gives you an idea of the kind of environment where gorse grow. So we made what we think is an extensive distribution of gorse 2 years ago when we did the study, and with a focus on Réunion Island. As you can see, it is present mainly near the sea, sometime on altitude, and it is particularly present in New Zealand and South Australia and Tasmania. In Réunion, it is present in high altitude in 2 places here, which is a protected areas classified in UNESCO heritage, and here pasture meadows. This confirms what we already noticed, that there is a strong relationship between altitude and latitude. Gorse grow at sea level, above 40 degrees of latitude, much higher in the tropics, and up to 3,500 close to the equator in Peru. So with this data, we made, we estimated the bioclimatic niche using a species distribution model with Biomod 2. We combined 9 different models, tested several scenarios. All that is described of the paper of Christina and Al. I think I gave the reference in the poster, but that's not the main topic of my talk today. So we had a good estimation of the bioclimatic niche with good sensitivity and specificity. And that kind of bioclimatic niche may allow to predict risk area, the probability of establishment of gorse population. What you can see here, everything is red, are places where the climatic conditions are suitable to gorse. Of course, other variables have to be added for final prediction, but at a large scale, these bioclimatic variables are determinant, and in areas where you know that the other variables are also appropriate, you think that the risk may be very high, that the probability that gorse can establish if it is introduced. So we identified several areas of risk, or some more, I think maybe here in South America. And except that is said by the specialists of gorse at Gorse New Zealand for quite a long time, probably in here, New Zealand, and in the north, South Australia and Tasmania, gorse filled its potential niche, but probably that in all other places, the niche are not filled and gorse continue to expand. So is the ecological niche sufficient to make prediction? Even if we had the real ecological niche, that is bioclimatic niche, plus all the other physical and natural dimensions that you can imagine, we could predict where the area that are suitable for the establishment of gorse population. But except from some extreme point of view, establishment of a population does not mean that it will become invasive. And in particular, there is a question of impact, both ecological and sociological impact, but also of the perception of the population or on the public sphere, and that cannot be predicted only by ecological niche, even if it is very precise. This is why I proposed the concept of invasive niche, which is the sum of natural and social dimensions that lead a species to be considered as invasive in a given socio-ecosystem. Well, measuring the ecological niche is already not so easy because it has many dimensions, but even when you don't have all the dimensions, it is useful for understand and for predict. So I had the same idea for the social dimensions. Again, we calibrate all our work in Réunion Island, which we know well, and that was the thesis of Nathalie Udo, and we try to understand how the status of major invasive plants emerged in Réunion. Her method was to use semi-structured interviews, participant observation, and to look at many archives, books, etc., which is easier in Réunion because it is a small island colonized only since 350 years ago. So it was possible to retrace the whole story, what she did. That's an example of the outcome of her work, the number of documents in specialized literature, depending on the year. And that is what she called status. So the plant was first considered as useful, still a little bit, by agronomists and breeders. Then patriotic, that's very special. It was the Second World War because Réunion was abandoned at that time by settlers, writers of geographs. Landscaping because of its nice and long-lasting flowering, by botanists and tourist guides as an agricultural weed, by breeders, of course, and agronomists, and until recently by invasive, by ecologists and land managers. If we put that in a timeline, and try to explain these different status by local socio-ecological events, useful status corresponds to local needs in the beginning of the settlements, where it was usual to make massive importation to solve local problems. Patriotic status correspond to the World War. Landscaping status correspond where people began to go to nature for entertainment and contemplation. Noxious weed status with the agricultural development of breeding in high altitude of the island, and the invasive status with protection endemic species by the ONF, the creation of a national park, and the classification at the UNESCO heritage. And I don't know you, but when I see that line, it seems to me obvious that there will be something that will come later. But, well, we don't know. At a more global scale, what changes during that time is that we came from peasant agriculture to a productivist agriculture, to wild nature and the emotional register, to the emergence of the concept of biodiversity and endangered biodiversity, and to the idea that there was an inexhaustible natural resources, to the rise of ecology as a politics. So the invasive status is one of these status. And we were wondering what Gorse status was at a world scale. What explains the national public status and the intensity of the struggle against ghosts? So we used what we knew from Réunion Island, what were the important points to look at, and transfer that to the countries where our staff made fieldwork, to the ANR Maris, all countries of South America, because it was a single continent with different situation, and then added more countries. The methodology was the following: 3 search engines, 2 housing modes, 4 cluster criteria, or the name of the plant in Latin, English, local language, the name of the country in Latin, English, local language, where Gorse was also the name in speaking English country. We look at the 41st site, either at 21st sites, and what we looked at was the national level, the status given to the species, the local lists, the literature, management strategies, and very generally speaking, the way the word used to the discourse around Gorse. And similar thing at the international level. Doing that, Nathalie was able to identify the same status as in Réunion with invasive, noxious, landscaping, useful, with 3 types of usages that can be socioeconomic, environmental, or biomedical. And as you can see, the invasive status is always present. Just a minute. Okay. So at a global scale, there are always several status of gorse, invasive being only one of them, and the status of useful plants often appears, but the invasive status is always present. It's considered invasive in all countries out of Europe, including where it is absent. For example, in Japan, it is in the list of the invasive species of the country, and we weren't able to see one plant of gorse nowhere, even by asking by colleagues, botanists, etc. It seems to us that there's no gorse in Japan, but it is maybe in one garden, but that's all, botanical garden, but it is considered as invasive. Also, where its potential for expansion is low, for example, in Sri Lanka, there are 10 populations in small places, which is in a national park, but it is considered as invasive. So since gorse is considered invasive everywhere, what variable do we have to use to measure its ecological niche? We built an indicator, which is not the existence of the invasive status, but the importance of this invasive status in the public sphere. That indicator was built by Nathalie Udo. At the level 0, no publicization. Level 1, only in specialized literature by scientists and environmental managers. Level 2, the same, plus an official national list of invasive species or public institution. Level 3, gorse management action. And level 4, when it is mentioned also by amateurs and the general public. So that's 5-level indicator was a variable to be explained. We made that as rigorously as possible. I don't put that for you to read it, but it's in the paper. But to see that we try really to be rigorous, to do the same thing in all countries. Because that was easier and determine all the status, we added all the other countries were with attested presence of gorse. So we made that for 21 countries. Okay. So then what are the explanatory variables? They had to be relevant, of course, but they also had to be accessible for all countries through models or through the net. We used our previous work on the bioclimatic niche to estimate the proportion of the country whose bioclimatic conditions are favorable to gorse. We use a social distribution model with a maximum likelihood method and geolocalization data to estimate the proportion of the country whose climate is above the threshold. Latitude, we use the mean latitude. It's a proxy of the altitude occupied by gorse, so it may be important. Then the proportion of natural protected areas in the country and the presence of gorse in them. The proportion of permanent grassland in the country and the presence of gorse in them. In agricultural areas, but we knew when they are in agricultural areas, it's in permanent grassland. And we wanted an estimate of social progress, and we choose a social progress index because it is a multidimensional index that includes both social and environmental quality. You can find it easily off the net if you want more details. So we transformed that into variables. Some of them were quantitative, the proportion of climatic condition, protected area, permanent grassland, or the social progress index. And 3 others had 2 or 3 modalities, presence or absence. Or for the latitude, we took a range because there's not one latitude for a country. So we prefer to have something like a tropical, intertropical, or not. So we performed the Hill and Smith analysis. This analysis is suitable when you mix both qualitative and quantitative variables, and it distributed the countries into 2 main axes. Okay, and then with that we put our variable indicator of the publicization of the invasive status. And this is what we get. So as you see, there is a very clear gradient. That was not really expected, I might say. I hope to find something, but not such a clear gradient. We wonder if there was some kind of tautology in our variables, but a priori there is not. There's nothing in that really explains the status here. So there is a clear variance, that is, this model can predict very well the pace of the invasive status of gorse in the public sphere. So what are these two axes? In the first axis, you have ici absence of gorse in agricultural area, presence of gorse in natural protected area, climatic niche, and social progress index, which is what we call the social geographical axis. Why no gorse is agricultural area is important, because when gorse is present in agricultural areas, the status of agronomic pest may overcome the one of invasive species. The second axis is very clearly structured by the presence of permanent grassland on one hand and protected natural areas in the other hand. So it is clearly a variable of land use. Permanent grassland, natural protected areas. As you can see, the third axis has a climatic niche, which is orthogonal to the others. It is also a little present here in the first axis, one of socio-geographic variables, but it is mainly present on an axis which is totally orthogonal to the others, which does not mean that it has no importance. If you look at the variable alone, it is the one that has the more weight here. And also we only took countries where gorse is present, so it plays a role also in that part. This is what happens once gorse is present. But what is interesting is that it is present on a single axis that is orthogonal to the others. So when we want to interpret that, it means that if you want to predict where gorse would be considered in the public sphere as an invasive species, you will have to look partly at where it can establish, but also a lot on the socio-geographical condition of the species and of the land use, which the importance of the land use was predictable, but the way that you can manage to put that in variable to have accurate prediction is, I think, interesting. And we have some particular exceptions that may be explained more roughly, by more detailed look, or by the third axis. For example, in Peru, what happens in Peru is that gorse is got only present at very high altitude, and probably just a small part of the country goes to its bioclimatic niche. So what determines publicization of gorse as invasive species? We have seen there are social ecological factors, which are land use, agricultural model, the level of sensibility to biodiversity that is indirectly estimated by the proportion of natural protected areas or the social progress index. And all these cross with more natural variables, which is the overlap between the bioclimatic niche and areas of interest. This is when gorse is able to cross on farmland areas, then it will have the status of agricultural pest. And when gorse can grow on areas that correspond to protected natural areas, then it will have the status of invasive species. This status can coexist. They're not really mutually exclusive, but the status of invasive species is really very strong when the other status are low. There is a particular case of the tropics, because what happens is that in the tropics, gorse bioclimatic niche recovers natural protected areas. Why? Because we have seen that in the tropics, gorse grow at high altitude. altitude. And these places at high altitude, it's the case in Réunion, it's the case in Hawaii, it's the case in Sri Lanka, it's the case in many countries of South America, are a time where settlements or settlements by Europeans arrived later. When the settlements arrived, it was on the sea level, and the colonization of high altitude arrives later, and the arrival of modern agronomy at high altitude arrived later, which results in the fact that there is low human activity, less anthropicity of the middle, and often a very high level of endemicity. And these are the places where national parks are, for example, and these are hotspots of biodiversity. And because they are hotspots of biodiversity, of course, there is a need to protect them. So there's a fact that gorse is a danger for that endemic biodiversity, but it is also studied. It attracts international ecologists who will see gorse as a danger for that endemic biodiversity they came to study, and who will spread the status of invasive species. And that is probably one of the reasons why the status of gorse as a major invasive species is so international. So that status of invasive niche, I define it again as the sum of the natural and social dimensions that lead a species to be considered as invasive in a given socio-ecosystem. It may help to predict invasibility, it may help for action, but it can be declined, I think, in a more general way. In the same way that ecological niche was useful not only as a predictor, but as an explanatory factor to understand the coexistence of species or not, maybe we can move to something like the socio-ecological niche, which, as the ecological niche, does not have to have all his dimensions fulfilled, but that can give enlight the way to think prediction and coexistence. So it can be tested with other species, but I think that concept can go beyond the concept of invasive species and to other status. For example, the emblematic niche, where a species will be considered as emblematic, indigenized, or even predator, where are cats, wolves, or shark mainly considered as predators or mainly considered as endangered biodiversity. That kind of thing I'm studying. Actually, I hope I will be able to present one day my work on cats or goéland, where I can consider it as a weed or not, as a valuable with economic value or not. I think that way to mix natural and social dimension may be very powerful. It can be a potential tool for risk analysis to predict where there will be a risk. In the case of invasive species, it is clear that gorse will come somewhere, but where will it cause problems? Where it is good to prepare, to invest, for example, for methods to prevent it to spread or to, well, for that, I think you need that context, that concept. And also that way of looking at a species, not only on its natural expansion or impact, but also on the way it is included in a whole social ecosystem, implies to take into account not only the point of view of scientists and ecologists in that case, which you remember in the beginning, social science, since it's not, that's a real problem. To manage a country, I think it's a real problem. To manage a country only with a scientist element. The population has its word to say, even if they are not experts, but the way to manage that is quite difficult. That's why I would like to continue to work on. So I think that kind of concept may help to do some participatory action research, but on the reverse, I would like to do some participatory action research to improve the concept of invasive niche or socio-ecological niche, and to see how to use it for environmental management. So I finished. I just want to thank all those who participated to that study, our staff in Rennes and Bordeaux with ecologists and sociologists, and students who had to manage to be both, more or less, but they succeeded, and our technicians and engineers. In Réunion Island, a lot of people for lots of institutions. I think I didn't mention, but there was also Richard Hill and Hugo Lay in New Zealand who helped us a lot in the beginning, in Réunion and in France, all those who answered to our survey and all those who spoke to us privately, and were numerous. And last but not least, the funding. So that work was supported by a native CNRS for the first part, the ecological, evolutionary ecological part, the Einer Maris, that was interdisciplinary, the Observatory of Rennes, the French Botanical Society, and the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme de Bretagne. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for a great talk, very information-rich, very interesting, I think. So there's already quite a few questions. So we can start by the first one by Olivier Hertz. So Olivier, I turned on your microphone so you can ask your question.
Where can I see the question myself?
It's in the Q&R tab. Olivier, you don't have the, you have to turn on your microphone. Now you're allowed to normally. Otherwise, what were your sources for geolocated photographs? That was the question.
It's not me who did that. I will tell you. It's here. I will tell you. It's in the paper, I must say, first. And the now, so I need to share my screen. Okay, I can answer later on. It's
yes, that's fine.
Olivier,
if Olivier can. All right, so
there was Google photos, street views, and some of them who disappeared in between. And well, it's in the paper. And if you want to ask me specifically the question, I can send you all the information.
Okay. Olivier, you're.
I will look the detail in the paper. Thank you very much.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, all right, so then Roger Prodon had a question. So you can now activate your microphone. Roger? Well, can you read the... Otherwise,
I can read. Yeah. Yes, it is a typical pyrophyte, which means that it promotes fire, and it is promoted by fire because a fire destroys blocks the dormancy of the seeds. So fire was used as a control only in some cases, mainly in Tasmania and Australia, and only in agricultural areas, not in natural areas. So they burn the gorse, and they remove the roots, and also they used fire because since it breaks the dormancy of the seeds, it can remove the seed bank. All the seed germinate, and then the seed bank disappear. But it is not so. It's not really used anymore. Chemical control also causes problems. So it's physical and biological control depending on the countries.
Okay, Roger, you're happy with the... We can't get people to to talk today. Okay. Then Sergio Gonzalez. See? You can... Yes, Sergio, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you ask your question?
Yes, hello. Yeah, so my question was, because sometimes it's always like a point that is critiqued in many papers of ecological niche, is which climate variables or layers did you use? And if you use different kinds and different scales to try to get a better model of the potential distribution?
So we used different combination of variables, different scenarios. Actually, we used 14 of them. And then we chose the one who had the better, fits the better IUC. Well, that's it. And we choose these variables by the fact that there are not too much correlation between them, and also using our previous knowledge on gorse. I don't think we tried different scales, but we tried one, which we thought was the most. We tried two actually, but we tried two with no big difference. There was 5 kilometers square and 10 kilometers square, and there was not a lot of differences.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now Dominique Groffman has a question about the evolutionary genetics. So can you ask your question, perhaps? Dominique?
Yes, because I've
Yeah.
lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes, and I was wondering about what is known of the genetic evolutionary dynamics of gorse in enabling it to be a very successful invasive.
Yes, we did a lot of work on that. It is an exemplary that I told in the beginning, and a poly exemplary that is a mixture of two or three different genomes, one from Atlantic, one from Mediterranean. So it's very plastic, very diverse. There's such a high level of diversity that it's not easy to make the phylogeography. But we use some techniques to see what happens. And the genetic diversity, to summarize, is very high and is similar in the invasive and native zone, which reflects the fact that there are multiple introductions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to play my panel chair. I'm going to do panel chairing a little bit because we still have time for questions. I feel like the questions are centered a little bit too much on or not talking enough about one side of your talk, a big part, which is the social part, which I think you're interested in. So personally, I thought this was really interesting that you're using quantitative data on that. One thing I didn't get, because there was lots of information. When you use these predictors, you use that to try and project the publicization status of invasive, right? But did you also try to use this as a predictor for the actual presence which you use on the graphs, and also or perhaps you said it, but I'm not sure. You know, when you use these maps, can you try to correlate the perception of invasiveness with the actual
actually, there is no clear relationship when you look in presence. The action of control of gorse are not correlated to the abundance of gorse in the country. Because if you just look at abundance without adding where it is and what kind of land use, you have no correlation. And as I said, in Japan, there is no gorse, but it is considered as invasive. And in Chile and Bolivia, there are a lot of gorse, but it is mainly considered as useful. So contrarily to what even we expected, I thought there would have been a higher correlation between the abundance and the feeling of being invaded. And there is no.
But you have a quantitative analysis of this, because with your data, you can easily do it, perhaps see if there's a...
No, we cannot easily do it.
Okay.
Because we have well, we can qualitatively and into feeling. What we can do is that bioclimatic niche, but knowing exactly the abundance of gorse. In the map we provided, it's a kind of map of present absence. Each point is a 10 square kilometer. Then the abundance within it, it's very difficult. So we did it in Réunion. We could do it in New Zealand, but you need.
But using the proportion of area covered or something like this. Yeah.
Yes, and then you have to see that it plays a role, but in a way that is orthogonal to the others and does not explain such a high part of the variance, but it does play a role, but that role is not determinant.
Okay.
And of course, we would have liked to estimate the density of gorse, but it's not possible with the methods we used.
Okay, so then we can take a question from Clem. So if you can turn on your microphone, Clem, and ask your question.
Yes, I was wondering, you talked about and showed pictures of phenotypic differences between New Zealand and La Réunion and the native growth in Europe. Do you know more about what causes these phenotypic differences?
No, we just verified that these differences were partly genetic, only partly. Gorse is, as I said, there's a high level of genetic diversity. It's also a high level of phenotypic plasticity, adaptation. So we verified that, but we didn't go further because that was not our main focus of interest, and nobody else did it neither. It is difficult for with an exaploid species. So we don't know the origin. We just can try to understand the evolutionary forces behind that. And because there's also, I didn't tell you, but there's a very large phenotypic variability in Europe already, in the date of flowering, in the size, in the shape. And this is why we think that there are some constraints on that diversity in Europe that disappeared in New Zealand and that allow expression of different combination of phenotypes.
Interesting, thank you.
Sorry. Lamine, can you ask a question, or you can read it? But
yes, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, I was asking myself whether you had been able to notice new uses of the plants, new medicinal uses of the gorse in the areas where it is invasive.
Here in Réunion, there is no medicinal use. One is in Europe as a fleur de bac. It's against despair, I would say. We found different ones in mainly in South America. Most of the time, it's for peaceful or calm or against stress.
Okay, thank you. So, and well, it's not an additive question, but it's just a complementary. Was this use replacing the traditional use of local plants, or was it a new use? Could you answer that?
No, I can't.
No, thank you very much. Anyway,
that was doing it, but we had to go to places where we didn't go, which is mainly South America, where we have seen this usage.
Well, it's a great work. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I think. Pardon?
Yes, I saw the question of Jean-Louis Martin.
Yes, we can ask Jean-Louis to.
Because that's the question. The two next questions are on perception and publicization. Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Anne, for a very interesting, inspiring talk. And yes, my question was, you mentioned the loss of use as one of the factors that promoted invasion or development, of course, in places where it was introduced. So I was wondering if there have been places currently where they have promoted trying to promote use of gorse instead or together with control, or if that's an avenue which has not been explored at all by people.
Well, we try to introduce that idea. The problem, well, we were very excited about the idea in the beginning. The problem is that the uses as there were in Europe since middle of 20th century are used that ask a lot of man work. I'm not sure that they are appropriated to the current agriculture. That's one point. And the other point is that I don't know if you have seen in the legislation, it is forbidden to use, to sell, or to do anything with a plant qualified as invasive. That for me is a problem. So there is a technical problem because it has a lot of work, or you have to adapt what was done before. And there is a legislative problem, is that you are not, it is forbidden to buy, to sell, or even to exchange plants. So it's difficult. It's difficult. It may be, well, in South America, the use of hedges is still done, but not here. And that could have been a solution, mainly in agricultural work, in natural places. It is so hard to collect, so I don't think it's possible.
Okay, so now we can perhaps take the question by Julien, who hasn't asked a question yet.
There was Sergio with a perception, yes, and Julien, maybe the similar questions.
Yeah, I'm not sure because Julien, I don't know if it's about perception or about actual.
Yeah, you're right. Yes.
So you can tell us, Julien.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering, it kind of is similar to the question that was just asked. I was wondering if you could foresee any future usages for gorse again. I don't know if it could be used in biofuels or something, but you started answering that with the manual labor problem. And also I was just surprised to hear that invasive species are forbidden. It's forbidden to use them, which seems like a big problem. Like, how are they supposed to stop being invasive if a new usage is found, or if something changes, as we've seen it change in the wrong direction, like from being non-invasive to becoming invasive? But how could a scenario where a plant becomes non-invasive again take place in this situation?
Yeah, that's a big debate. Either you continue desperately to consider that any exotic species is not at its place in that ecosystem, and you begin a struggle that most of the time you will lost, or you accept a new species in a new ecosystem. Well, this is a little Manichaean. Of course, you can also reduce the expansion of a species and accept it in some places. But it is true, and I'm one of those who think that sometimes invasive species has to be accepted and not struggle against, at least sometimes. And this is that point of view, I would say, helped by global change and if the temperature, the climate change, new species will come. But of course, also some species are destructive. The problem with the law of 214, it was the first law on invasive species. So from that point of view, it was a good law. The problem is that contrarily to what we recommend as experts in the UCN debate, etc., they didn't mean several kinds of invasive species. There's just one kind. And that kind, you are not allowed to do anything with it, except if you want to destroy it. So you can create an economical rentability. It is done here a little bit in Réunion with some herbs, but in France or in Europe, it's European regulation. So I talked with lawyers who told me, well, at the beginning, the law will change, but the way law is actually now in Europe, well, and even if you look at the IUCN, they made a survey of valorization of invasive species. They always find it very dangerous. There is the idea that there is a risk that people will want to maintain them. From my point of view, they are maintained anyhow. So let's use them. But yes, I think the law have to change, and it will change because there is not one, but several kinds of invasive species. And for some some of them, the best thing to do is to use them. And some of them also were proven to be beneficial for some kind of endemic biodiversity also. But that's a big debate, even among ecologists and managers and population. And we are not held by the law. I don't know who made the law, but for me and for the people, it is not really appropriated.
Sorry, just a small follow-up. Do you know who classifies a species as being invasive? Is it the Department of Agriculture or Ecology in each country or state? Or
no, I think it's a consensus, and IUCN plays a big role in that. Each country had to, well, they made the reglement first and say, well, the country will decide afterward what species they will put on. The country said, no, I don't want, because I have valorized the species. This species has some economical value. So they were confident you will not plant bison or acacia or some other. And in the beginning, there was only 7 species where all Europe agrees to put in the list. Because the country was too strong. So it's made at the country level, and it's a group of experts that probably depends on the country. And the IUCN is a lot solicited to make that list. But the regulation is so strong that there are few species on that list. There are several LODs, several plants of marine organisms, and it's very narrow, because once a species on that list, you cannot do anything with it.
Okay, we are running out of time a bit, so you can take one last question. I'll let you choose.
Yes, I like the one on alkaloid. You will find the answer on the paper.
Okay, yes. So I'll just open
and the
Sergio's question.
Yeah, the one of perception publication. That's the center of my topic. Yes, I think it has implication for conservation action of other endemic or endangered species, because the idea of a public status, well, you will begin to have an action once the status goes in the public sphere. If it is just a group of ecological experts who say, well, that small plant here is endangered, it will have no effect. You need money, you need the support of the politics, you need the support of the population, which means you need the presence of the status in the public sphere. So understanding what makes that status important in the public sphere helps you. It's a 2-dimensional process. It helps you to know how to convince your partners, but it also helps you as an ecologist to know what fight has to be done and what fight go against the global perception of the population. So if together you work with the sensibility of ecologists and have in mind the perception and the publicization, it's possible to be more efficient on one hand, and more in phase with the will of the adhesion of the population, local population in the other hand. That's what I believe. Okay,
so that's a nice word to finish the talk. So thanks again for the very stimulating talk. So everyone, so as we said, the next 2 weeks we won't have a seminar, and then we're coming back with Dan Wanreich, I think. So you look for the announcements. Thanks again, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. Nice weekend for you too.